Hey, how you doing? This is Mr. Arvidas again. This time we're going to be looking at the Ottoman Empire. I had a couple of snow days, kept us out of class, but this will make up for that. So, the Ottoman Empire, one of the things that I always thought about them, in high school, I didn't really know much about them. I kind of just knew that they were in Age of Empires, and that was about it. I knew about the Janissaries because of, well, Age of Empires. It wasn't really until college that I got to learn a little bit about them. And so for AP, they do have a decent amount that you have to kind of know about them and the other Muslim empires of this early modern period. One thing I think that should be noted about the Ottoman Empire is just it is an impressive empire in the terms of its size. It is a very big square mile place. It's also big in terms of ethnicity. There are multiple ethnic groups in there. There's multiple religions in there. And all of these things kind of factor in. These are the things that AP always loves to point out. And so what we're going to be talking about in this presentation is some of those. This one should only be about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. So we'll see how that timetable keeps for us. So let's get started. So here we go. We see this map here. This is a good map, I think, and it could be used for AP. You can think like multiple choice. Kind of could get a few questions here and there, especially about the spread of the empire, how big it got. When they captured Mecca is a big point. When they get Constantinople, obviously, is a huge point. How far they get into Europe, specifically the Balkan area of Eastern Europe. These are all big time things that are usually highlighted in AP. Now, when we look at this map, we know this is going to take us all the way to the full extension of the empire, as it says right here, maximum extension, 1683. This is a massive empire in scope. Now, obviously, the beginnings of it, it wasn't very big at the beginning. Starting out in the 1300s is really where we see the Ottoman Turks come into play. They come out of this area in here and then go into Turkey. Now, what caused them to take over? Well, I mean, the Mongolians. The Mongolians created a weak center. The former Abbasid Empire was kind of dismantled by them. The Seljuk Turks, who had kind of controlled since the Crusades, the Second Crusade at least, had been diminished by the Mongolians. And so when the Ottoman Turks came in, they were able to take over some of these territories, and specifically, as you can see in the early parts of the map, they get right up to Constantinople right away, and then they're gradually going to expand in Turkey in each generation. And then they'll even expand into Greece, and they'll completely isolate the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Byzantine Empire effectively is going to fall apart by this. But it's really, we look at the mark of this is the 1453, the taking of Constantinople. This is a huge point in history. There's a couple of things that actually happened right around this same time period that are all really important. One, in Western Europe, you get the printing press. I always like to say that's probably the most important thing to come out of Western Europe at this time. But specifically the fall of the Byzantine Empire, what this is going to do is it's going to cause people in Western Europe to start to look for other avenues. So this trade that had formerly taken them here, they're going to start to look for avenues either around Africa, or Spain, of course, will go there in 1492. And, that's what we're going to start seeing. But that doesn't mean trade as a whole stopped in the Mediterranean. In fact, it actually got a lot larger. What we saw was Venice, in this area right here. They began to trade heavily with the Ottomans, and they got a lot of this trade that came in through the Silk Road. They got a lot of the trade that went in along the coast of India, and it was an extremely important thing. It made Venice extremely wealthy. We saw the other Italian city-states also get involved in this sea trade. Now the trick was they were trading with the Muslim Empire, and that was always the big down part of it, and that's what got them criticized a lot. Also, we saw a couple of wars take place where they had to go fight in these, and so that, those are some big factors, I think, that are important to know in the larger scheme of things. But what should be noted is how quickly, once Constantinople fell, you're looking at a century later, and they've more or less conquered all of this stuff, right? they're going to get stopped in Eastern Europe. They'll get stopped along the African coast, but that's about as far as they're going to extend. And the question, of course, is going to be how do they do that, and more specifically, how do they run their empire? Because that's really what I find the most important things are going to be. So let's move on. All right. So the empire itself, there's a couple things that we have to understand about the empire. This map I put up here, I'm trying to put a lot of visual maps for you guys because, again, this is a map that you could see a short answer question coming off of. You could also see multiple choice questions coming off of. And what we're looking at are the land and sea trade, and we can see what areas are going to become dominant as a result. Look at how valuable Egypt is now because of the multitude of trade going through there. And then, of course, we have to remember the Safavids and the Mughal Empire in India and Persia are getting taxes off these trades too. But then specifically, we see this Mediterranean block trade that's starting to occur. So the empire, it's kind of weird because textbooks a lot of times go into this slave court system, slave armies. Of course, they're going to talk about the Janissaries because the Janissaries are kind of the big thing with the Ottomans, and I'm going to get into them more specifically in a second. But I want to talk about this slave court system that they seem to bring up again and again. The problem is, at least the textbook that we use, it makes it seem like there are no government officials who aren't slaves. And quite frankly, that is a little ridiculous. In fact, there were a multitude of government officials that weren't slaves. They had a lot of people who inherited their positions. They had a lot of people who ran governorships just the same way that they did in every part of the world. The slave court, though, what they're referring to is the bureaucracy they set up is largely going to be run by slaves. And the term slave is also loosely here because they do get paid. They are forced into this, and they're highly educated. So then that's very important to kind of recognize is they do have a high education system with these people. Now, they are taken. A lot of them are taken from this Eastern European area. That's where the Janissaries essentially come from, and that's where a lot of these court guys come from. And they teach them the language, they teach them the religion, and they're going to take them at the age of 6 to 10, somewhere around there, and they're going to force them into this setup. The reason they did this is they didn't want squabbles between noble families who had positions of power. Instead, they would educate people and put people who were good into those positions. Now, this is going to work for a little while, and it seems like a good system. However, it becomes highly corrupt by the end of the Ottoman Empire. And the reality is they become far less slaves. And as we'll see with the Janissaries, they end up having far more power than they were ever really supposed to have. And so that kind of changed things up a little bit. So we still have a wealthy aristocracy. One thing I should point out is the Ottoman Empire runs its empiric system. They have a lot of regional governors. Okay, so they have people who are in charge of regions. A lot of times these are former Janissaries. When we get later in the empire, the Janissaries end up getting a lot of this power, and that's where we get that slave court kind of coming in again. But again, as we'll discover with the Janissaries, they're not the traditional look of slaves that you would kind of imagine. So that's what we're kind of seeing. We also see people inherit land in certain areas. We see a lot of land ownerships. We see a lot of people start to form semi-feudalistic societies. A lot of the land in here is given away to the soldiers who fight for regional control. And so a lot of these soldiers get a lot of that land. And that's kind of important because once they stop expanding, the problem is there's no more land to give away, and that creates unrest in the empire, and you get some revolts from the soldiers, and then the Janissaries request more political power, and so yeah, you can see where that would start to come into play. And that brings up our buddies, the Janissary Corps. Aside from being just overall some of the best fighters in the world at the time, a couple things that should be noted. I'm going to go over them a little bit more in depth. They are originally comprised of slaves. So originally they are slaves. They were actually Christians who were taken in Eastern Europe, and they were shipped off to Muslim families where they were raised, and they learned the traditions of Islam. They did learn the language. They were given absolute, they're supposed to be absolutely loyal to the Sultan, right, who's actually in charge of this whole thing. And the big thing about the Janissary Corps that makes them significant is they're really the first firearm-based unit in warfare. They are going to be very early on a strictly firearm-based military corps. And no other country had that. We're still dabbling between the implementation of firearms and spears and swords, and they were the first ones professionally trained in this. And this made them highly effective early on. They don't adapt very well later, which is why they get obliterated in the 1800s. But that's going to be something early on that gave the Eastern Europeans, in particular, a lot of trouble. And Austria struggled with them, and they lived in legend in Austria because they were so good. The last thing I think we should make note of is the Ottoman Empire is going to make massive amounts of money through trade. And that's one of the things they realized very early on. I don't want you to think, and sometimes I think in Western civ classes, we get this idea that the Ottomans were refusing to trade with Europeans, and that's not necessarily true. They did add some taxes onto it, but that's how you make money. And the reality was they ciphered in trade coming all the way from China, ciphered in trade coming from India, from Persia, from Africa. So they had, essentially that Afro-Asian trade coming in, and they were the brokers for Europe, so they could charge whatever they wanted. And that's the thing that I think people get hung up on, and it's one of the reasons why Europeans did find other ways to go there. But that's really how they made a lot of their money. How the nobles made their money is all through trade. So, and obviously, if you look at this map, they have an extensive land trade routes. They also have sea trade. Their navy is going to be fairly large throughout their history. Though, as we'll discover, Spain goes to war with them. The Russians go to war with them. Just Christianity in general tends to fight the Ottomans. And all of this is facilitated through the Italian merchants, as I mentioned before. So your guys from Venice and Florence, they begin to do heavy trade with the Ottomans, and they finance a lot of that trade. And so, it's a kind of interesting because you get a lot of cultural exchanges from there. The banking system, the numerical systems that they're using in this part of the world is a little bit more sophisticated than what they're using in Europe. And they're going to take that with them. They're going to borrow it. They're going to use it. And, that's just the way the technological stuff kind of goes. Early on, it should be noted, the Ottoman Empire was also very willing to take in ideas from outside. They had a heavy influence of Greek. Just being in Turkey in general, there's going to be a heavy influence of Greek culture. And so they had that, and they took in outside ideas. Now, this is going to fade. We're going to see that fade by the 1700s, along with the power of the empire. They begin to become a little bit more secluded. And then in the 1800s, when they do eventually try and adapt again, it causes a collapse. Let's talk about our dudes, the Janissaries. And if you're wondering, yes, this picture is from Age of Empires. So the Janissary Corps, as you can see here, it's your first major riflemen. They also specialized in cannons. The Janissary Corps is really cool for a lot of reasons. One, obviously, one of the most powerful military forces in the history of the world. Now they grew exponentially. Let's put it this way: there were 1,000 Janissaries in 1400. When we get to 1700, right, you're looking at around 65,000. So that's a massive army, especially if it's comprised of slaves. But the thing is, it wasn't in the 1700s. It was actually far more political. So originally, the Janissaries had a few rules. One, they couldn't get married, and they couldn't have kids. They actually just prevented them from doing this in a very easy way. They made them eunuchs, and that kind of settled that. They had to live in a military barracks up until their retirement age, and then eventually, if they made it to retirement, they would actually get property. They could become governors if they rose in the ranks. They were actually taken care of very well by the empire. Now, it should be noted, these things changed. The Janissary became so powerful by the 1600s that they changed some of these rules. They said, wait up, time out, we can get married. Secondly, not every Janissary is going to be some stolen Christian boy, right, from Eastern Europe. No, it's going to be volunteers. So there's going to have a lot more volunteers in the Janissary Corps, and that's a big change as well. Now, what all of this did is it made the Janissary Corps a huge political arm in the Ottoman Empire. So you had the sultans and the aristocracies, right? That landowner elite who inherited all their property. And then you had the Janissaries, who were this new slave army, if you will, who realistically held the emperor, or sultan rather, hostage multiple times throughout the empire's history. They fought for better rights for them. They didn't have to live in barracks anymore. They could get married. They could inherit. And it actually, by the late 1700s, the Janissary Corps had diminished in capability because, one, they refused to change. They refused to let other parts of the Ottoman army use the same weapons they were using. And then they also began to control politics and didn't let the Ottoman Empire adjust to the time period that was the 1700s. And so we did not see a lot of political adjustment. A lot of this is largely due to the Janissaries. And you could argue that in the 1700s, the Janissaries were largely responsible for most of the policies that the Ottoman Empire, put forth. They ran a lot of this stuff. So it's kind of an interesting little grouping. But let's move on. It should be noted that politically, the Ottoman Empire had two groups. You had the traditional landowners, right? And then you had the military. The military handled all foreign matters, all warfare, obviously, and a lot of the state stability issues. The landowners handled most of the courts and the regular laws and everything like that. So one of the things that I always like to point out is some of the massive works that we see come up during this time period as a result of these takeovers by the Ottomans. And one is Constantinople. Constantinople had been pretty messed up during the sieges that took place in the 1400s, and there was a lot of rebuilding that took place. Now, this building right here is not rebuilt. It's just converted into a mosque, right? This is the Hagia Sophia, one of the largest cathedrals in all of Christianity. Well, it was converted into one of the largest mosques in all of Islam. Now, the picture over here, which looks fairly similar, so you can see the design is obviously almost identical, is actually going to be the Solimaya Mosque, which was built in the 1500s by the Sultan Suleiman the Great. And this was actually designed, it's actually a perfect example of what the sultans did. A lot of them focused building projects in Constantinople, either large bridges, mosques, or monuments. And the reason they did that was to kind of better the city and make themselves feel a little better about themselves. So we see a lot of them build these large structures. What's interesting is you get a nice combination of architecture, and I think that that's something that should be kind of understood. We see the language of the Ottomans, Turkish, become the primary language going forward, and that's an important thing because for a while the primary language, obviously, you had Arabic and then you had Persian, but Turkish is now kind of a newer one that's getting put into prominence. And we see a lot of the poetry, of course, and the literature is all written in that. The artwork is actually similar to the Byzantines, with mosaics being the more featured of them. So, it's something that I think is pretty important. Some would argue the government spent far too much money redoing Constantinople. It was the most modern city on earth, and they redid it every couple of years, and that may or may not have created some financial windfalls. So now let's look at the decline of the empire. Well, the decline of the empire is actually pretty simple when you think about it. One, they had a lot of enemies. All of Western Europe pretty much did not like the Ottoman Empire, and they get attacked multiple times by whoever the big European powers of the day are. When you get to the 1800s, you'll even talk about the Crimean War, where actually a bunch of the European powers side with them, but still, the Ottomans don't make out well in that. They don't do well in these large-scale wars once you get past the 1600s. They tended to struggle, and a lot of that is because they didn't have the political organization these other countries had. They had remained with regional governors. They remained with a lack of centralization, with a military wing that was out of sorts, and I think that kind of does it. 1700s really where we see the fall off. The 1600s, they're still pretty powerful, and even the 1700s they are, but we start to see a steady decline, right? That decline continues to occur throughout the 1700s. Political corruption, this sounds very familiar, right? Political corruption occurs on every level. The schools in which the bureaucracy was trained, they became very corrupt, and they started to appoint people to positions. We saw the Janissaries obviously restrict the growth of the empire in certain ways. They did not allow policies of peace in the 1600s, which caused them to kind of overexpand and lose a couple of wars here and there. The Janissaries also held the Sultan hostage on occasion and wouldn't let him actually, run the country. So I think that was another big issue. Failure to adapt. Other countries in the 17 and 1800s are becoming far more centralized. Their economies are becoming far more diverse. They're industrializing. Quite frankly, the Ottomans don't do that. There was a slight lack of natural resources, but as we see, a lot of the places where they could have had natural resources begin to leave in the 17 and 1800s. They had far too many religions, too many ethnic groups that they restricted rights for, and they revolted, and that's a common occurrence in any empire, and they just weren't able to control it. We think about the Roman Empire and their ability to control, it was because their military was so powerful and their military was used as an arm of that control. The Ottomans did not always do that, and the military outside of the Janissaries was largely feudalistic in terms of how its organization was set up. Nationalism and revolts kind of goes with what I just said. In the 1800s in particular, post-Napoleon, we see the nationalism erupt in Eastern Europe. We see Europeans support a revolution in Greece. We see revolutions in Serbia and Bosnia. And then we're also going to see, obviously, Egypt becomes independent and then taken over by the British. So nationalism in general hurt. And we go all the way to the end of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, where nationalist groups were promised independence if they helped revolt against the empire during the war, and they did. And, of course, the Europeans kind of messed them over in that one in the long run. And then, lastly, is there too much diversity in the empire? And that's a question I think you have to answer for yourselves. I would not necessarily say diversity is a bad thing. Obviously, some countries like the United States have done pretty well with that, but the idea that they had so many different nationalities in this one country, and they were heavily nationalistic, and they didn't recognize them. Austria-Hungary is a great example of a country that adapted to that nationalism. Now, it didn't work out well in the long run, but they did. The Ottomans never fully did that. Their government was far too weak. When they tried to change the government, there was a lot of people pushing against it, and they tried to get parliamentary systems in place in the 1800s, and none of it ever really worked out. The diversity of the empire and the lack of acceptance of outside groups ultimately doomed them. They're also doomed because of other things like the Janissary Corps, which was never kept in check, and that they're destroyed in the 1800s, and it kind of destroyed the elite wing of their army and any fear that anybody had for them. So, yeah, that more or less sums up everything I had to say about the Ottoman Empire. A couple of things as you kind of go forward. Understand this is almost like an absolutist state. You have a sultan who rules it. Then you have your stereotypical landowner bureaucracy. And then you have that slave bureaucracy, which actually runs a lot of the ins and outs of the country, which I think is important to recognize. And then, of course, the trade revenue and how they made money via trade. Other things that I think are important is the cultural exchanges. Obviously, bringing back Greek and Roman cultures was a huge thing, and the Ottomans helped facilitate that, especially using records from Alexandria, Egypt, and the records that they had in Turkey of this, because Constantinople, as most of you might remember, in the Byzantine Empire was the center of Greek culture. Well, that kind of wraps it up. I hope you got something out of this, and till next time.